On March 30th, 1972, massed North Vietnamese Army artillery opened up in a shattering barrage. The targets for the guns and rockets were South Vietnamese positions across the demilitarized zone, separating north and south. As the guns blasted South Vietnamese defenses, upwards of 20,000 of Giap's troops and 200 of his 600 tanks waited in their jumping-off positions. At noon, they surged forward as the South Vietnamese units fled in panic. Facing the northern onslaught was a weak South Vietnamese infantry division and a Marine brigade. Their 12,000 troops were scattered across 13 combat bases and outposts. The enemy assault caught the infantry division just as it was moving regiments from one position to another. The southern defense was thrown into complete chaos. Intelligence reports had predicted a northern attack, but no one had expected it to come on the demilitarized zone. After 2 days of confused fighting, on April 2nd, the South Vietnamese began to retreat to a new defensive line. The northern offensive across the demilitarized zone had forced the South Vietnamese to fall back to Route 9 and the Qua Viet River. To the west, the line was held by Camp Carroll, the Rock Pile, and the My Loc combat base. In 2 days, these bases fell and the NVA pushed to within 10 miles of Quang Tri City. Further south, the city of Hue was threatened from 2 directions. Facing the NVA were the South Vietnamese 1st Division and a division of Marines. The attack opened on April 1st, 1972. To the west, the 324B Division pushed Southern forces back in heavy fighting. For a time, the defenders held a line from the Mai Chan River to Firebase Bastogne, an old American outpost. But soon, even that line was being pushed back. The North Vietnamese attack on Quang Tri City and the push towards Hue were furious assaults. But on April 9th, after a few days of fighting, the NVA were forced to halt their attacks and resupply. Outside Quang Tri, the North's failure to keep up the pressure saved the South Vietnamese defense from complete collapse. For the first few days of the northern offensive, 3 days after the first North Vietnamese attack, in the far south of Vietnam, there was another major thrust. This time, the assault was barely 50 miles from the southern capital, Saigon. The South Vietnamese forces defending Saigon were the 18th Division, the 5th Division, and the 25th, along with 3 Ranger groups. On the North Vietnamese side, 3 divisions, at one time Southern Viet Cong, but now almost completely northern, were backed by tanks and 2 independent infantry regiments. The North Vietnamese first launched a diversionary attack towards Tay Ninh City, overrunning South Vietnamese garrisons. In the main blow, the 5th Division assaulted Loc Ninh. In spite of intense American air support, the town fell. Meanwhile, the 7th cut Route 13 and the 9th prepared to attack An Lac. The assault at An Lac had been entrusted to the 9th Division, but almost a week passed and the division still hadn't launched its attack. During the holdup, American helicopters were ferrying men and supplies into the threatened city. B-52 strikes hit the NVA assembly areas with devastating effect. The finally mounted its assault on An Lac on April 13, 1972. At once, American helicopter gunships pounced on the attackers. In 3 days of mass infantry assaults, spearheaded by tanks, North Vietnamese troops managed to seize the northern part of the city. But they failed to break the defense. The 4,000-strong South Vietnamese force, reinforced by elite airborne units, held their positions and launched furious counterattacks, accompanied by renewed B-52 strikes. The carnage would continue until on May 15th, the Viet Cong forces withdrew. In the central highlands, the targets for 2 NVA divisions were the provincial capitals of Kon Tum and Pleiku. The defenders, the South Vietnamese 22nd Division, fell back in disarray, but were instantly reinforced, and they succeeded in holding the town. Meanwhile, the NVA seized control of most of Binh Dinh province, threatening to cut the country in 2. On April 6th, Nixon ordered the resumption of full-scale airstrikes over the north and naval gunfire to support the beleaguered South Vietnamese. On April 27th, 2 weeks after the first North Vietnamese attack on Quang Tri City, the NVA renewed their assault. Reinforced by the 325th Division, they pushed to within a few miles of the city. The defenders, the South Vietnamese 3rd Division, which had withstood heavy bombardment for over a month, panicked and fled down Highway 1, along with thousands of civilians. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese army took possession of Dong Ha on April 29th and Quang Tri on May 1st. Abandoned by their officers, the flight of the South Vietnamese Army's 3rd Division, along with the soldiers' families and the inhabitants of Quang Tri, was a rout. In the confusion, bridges were blown too soon, stranding men and equipment. The road had been mined, and the North Vietnamese added to the chaos by shelling the retreating columns with tank and artillery fire. As many as 20,000 may have been killed or wounded, many of them civilian refugees. The fear now was that the NVA would follow up their victory by storming down Route 1 to the city of Hue. There, the South Vietnamese Army's 1st Infantry Division and 2 brigades of Marines were dug in round the city. In fact, Massive American firepower, including the heavy guns of warships offshore, made certain the northern divisions could advance no further.